designer psychologies, or customized cognitive processing modalities. A processing modality being that specific and unique way in which we take in, analyze, and perceive the world. These are the psychological frameworks that allow for person-to-person variances in subjectivity, including such things as emotional responses, the level of social engagement, aesthetics, and prioritization. Most of us in this room have the so-called neurotypical cognitive processing modality. We know, however, mostly through our interactions with those outside of the cognitive norm, that neurotypicality is not the be-all and end-all of psychological experience. As the autism rights movement has demonstrated, our tendency to describe anyone outside the neurotypical norm as being abnormal, pathological, or broken in some way, it's not entirely accurate or fair. Impairment is in the eye of the beholder, and in many cases we are finding considerable value in the neurodiverse experience. Indeed, autism is a really good example of this. While it can largely be characterized as a social communication disorder, this definition is clearly an expression of the neurotypical bias, which, rightly or wrongly, places great value on person-to-person interactions and social conventions. Autistics don't necessarily see this as a problem, and they're often quite content to focus on their own thoughts and interests. Moreover, it's through the autistic lens that the world can be processed, understood, and appreciated in a way that's qualitatively different than through the neurotypical mind. In fact, society benefits from neurodiversity. It carries an intrinsic worth. It's through different kinds of thinking that we get alternative perspectives on the world. And as a result, unique and often astounding forms of expression. Famous autistics, for example, have produced great works of art, scientific theories, and even such strange and seemingly out-of-the-box things like cattle calming chutes, thanks to the likes of the Temple Grandins of the world. Now, as I address the potential for designer psychologies, I'm not necessarily saying that we should develop technologies that are going to all help us become autistic, though if that's your cup of tea, then go for it. But what I am suggesting is that autistics give us a glimpse into the other, that there is huge potential for other cognitive modalities outside of neurotypicality, and that we should consider developing our neurosciences such that we can individually tailor our psychologies in accordance with our values, our changing environments, technologies, social arrangements, not to mention alongside our enhancements and modifications. Okay, so why do we need to reach outside the bounds of our neurotypicality? What's so wrong with our brains that we can't leave well enough alone? Well, as just mentioned, there is intrinsic personal and societal worth to neurodiversity, but in addition, it's an expression of our cognitive liberty and our right to modify our minds as we see fit. Moreover, it's a way for us to improve upon an increasingly outdated piece of equipment, namely our paleolithic brains. While there's significant variance within neurotypicality, we tend to agree that it defines a strict band of cognitive traits and normal functioning that, when transgressed, leads to pathology, or in some cases, extreme giftedness. Now, while we may think that there is great diversity within neurotypicality, it's nothing compared to the potential space of possibilities that exist outside of it. It's within this small patch of normalcy that Homo sapiens, for the most part, currently dwells. We're a species that finds itself in a post-industrialized information-era civilization, a situation far removed from the environment in which we evolved over the course of hundreds of thousands of years. And it's for this reason that neurotypicality should also be thought of as paleoneurology. Our minds are most suited to life in paleolithic tribal environments. Our psychologies are all adaptive traits that resulted in such characteristics as tribalism, hierarchic social arrangements, the Dunbar limit, which represents the maximum number of social connections we can have, our cognitive biases, the strictly calibrated emotional responses that we have, and we tend to have an aesthetic appreciation for nature, organic forms, and organic things. We obviously don't live in a Paleolithic society, well, except in my household, but many of these traits have resulted in a number of maladaptive behaviors, including proclivities for addiction and modern diseases like depression, obesity, ADHD, and stress. It's resulted in environmental and social alienation. We have great difficulty dealing with noise and light pollution, for example, or we tend to be placed in social arrangements that are far removed from our tribal and familial settings. This is a problem that's not getting better anytime soon. In fact, we as biological creatures have created a civilization that is increasingly complex and even post-biological. We tend to become even further distanced and alienated from our settings as time passes. Sure, many of the things we have are deliberately designed to please, but that's also part of the problem, leading to such things as web and video game addiction. And yet other things that surround us are completely outside of intentional design, the products of brute utilitarianism. Think concrete slabs, roads, telephone poles, computer code, massive data sets, and so on. And then there's the potential for new information and experience owing to enhancement, where our psychologies are poorly equipped to comprehend it and provide some kind of subjective assessment. From a certain vantage point, the designer psychologies initiative could be seen as a kind of cognitive enhancement. And I don't really have a huge problem with that, but this is more than just enhancement. It's more than just such things as increased attention spans, intelligence, and memory, traits that can be clearly labeled as improvements. It's through designer psychologies that we can strive to be different and not just better. This is why the neurodiversity movement is so important. It's about creating alternatives. Consequently, alternative psychologies may actually result in the voluntary onset of impairment, or at least impairment as viewed through the lens of other modalities. This will be a very tricky area to navigate in terms of the ethics, but it's a conversation that needs to be had. And by alternative psychologies, I am referring to fundamental changes in the ways our brains perceive and process information. Our brains are largely pre-configured to help us interpret and operate in the world in the ways we do, much like a computer processes information. And this computer analogy can be traced back to the mathematician Claude Shannon, who described information processing as the conversion of latent information into manifest information, which is basically the process of having unprocessed or pre-processed information, whether sent out by the environment or by an intentional agent, delivered to a receiver, and having the intended receiver transform, process, and potentially respond and act on that information. Along the way, our brains do such things as data filtering and prioritization, and this helps us distinguish signal from the noise. We have little or no control over what we think is important, valuable, or aesthetically pleasing. These are largely autonomous responses. How wonderful would it be to recalibrate these information processes according to our needs as a transhuman or modified species? In the 70s, it was Abraham Moles and Frieder Nick who established and analyzed the links between information processing and aesthetics. They argued that the subjective experience of interpreting incoming data is dependent on the software set up in the brain. So it's here where we can work to change our seemingly innate preferences. So what kinds of things would we want to do? What are some examples of designer psychologies? The space of all possible and worthwhile psychologies is absolutely massive. Let's skip this slide. Neurotypicality is but a tiny speck of what's possible. While it would be impossible for me to predict the various ways in which we might want to alter our cognitive modalities, there are a number of areas we might want to consider. Aesthetics, altering our preferences. We can adapt our minds to our environments and technologies rather than the other way around. Emotions, changing the ways we respond emotionally, including mood enhancement. Biases, we can systematically eliminate the 100 cognitive biases, those deviations in human judgment that are currently impairing human thinking, basically debugging the software. Social engagement, we can strengthen or weaken our emotional ties and increase empathy. And morality, we can engage in moral enhancement and improve on our character. Plus many other traits, including those factors that we're still unsure about and how they will impact on personal and conscious awareness. These examples are all arguably within neurotypical experience, and I would imagine that the kind of designer psychologies that will come into existence will be profoundly different than anything we have ever experienced. Now, up to this point, there's been a lot of hand-waving on my part to describe the ways in which we could actually tweak our brains to such a degree. Thankfully, there are, in fact, a number of promising areas that may make the vision of designer psychologies possible. There's targeted psychopharmaceuticals, such as advanced drugs, adaptive harnessing, which is the better utilization of the brain's current systems, genomics, which will impact on our genetic constitutions, cognitive implants, which include things like brain pacemakers, artificial neurons, and molecular nanotechnology, of course. Now, given the potential for designer psychologies and the implicit understanding that this will be up to individual choice, the potential for neurodiversity to explode in the future is astounding. Designer psychologies will increase diversity and result in greater tolerance for different mind types. It will vastly increase and expand subjective awareness, resulting in greater potential for creativity, scientific and technological breakthroughs, and forms of expression. It will further the cause of cognitive liberties and ultimately result in less suffering as we gain greater control over our mental faculties. In a society that decries transhumanism and human enhancement as a way to homogenize humans, I hope that the prospect of designer psychologies will show our detractors that the post-human future will be more diverse and inclusive than anyone can possibly imagine. Thank you.